Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today, we're talking about hidden efficiencies in common processes. And I thought this was a great topic for today because so often a lot of the inefficiencies that, we kind of unpack or uncover throughout our business seem to hide right in plain sight, right? We know about a lot of the different, problems and challenges that we face on kind of any given day. But what lies underneath that a lot of times, right? So those I say often, those are like the symptoms that we see, but what lies underneath that are kind of these, hidden inefficiencies that every one of the people on our team have to deal with. And from a leadership perspective, obviously we're dealing with that as well. Wanted to unpack that today. One of the things that I see a lot of times when it comes to dealing with these inefficiencies, right, is we often will look at like each one of these opportunities kind of within its own, silo or narrow scope. And so what ends up happening over the course of time, and I'll use an example here. Let's say we're talking about something within customer service, right? Regardless of if you're a product-based business like a manufacturer or service-based business like a consultant, right? You've got customer service. You're kind of dealing with that customer interaction, whether that's writing up orders or whatever is going on throughout those process flows. And so when we take a look at that, right, while we may be achieving efficiency gains within order entry, let's say, that may impact something happening down the line. And if we don't look at things a bit more holistically, especially over the course of time, and you see this, kind of unfold with a lot of companies that are, seeking lean initiatives or operational excellence, continuous improvement, right? But you see this where you will be ultra efficient at, in one aspect, but it's at the expense of another. And so that is what we, want to avoid with this, right? So it's not just a matter of identifying these hidden inefficiencies and ultimately rectifying that. It is doing that from a systems perspective, if you will, looking at your entire business as a system, looking at things as a whole to understand what's the impact across the organization. Does it move us closer to the goals of the organization? So in terms of, where I will typically see these inefficiencies hiding, first and foremost, right, communication. It is easy to say and hard to do, right? So simple, not easy. That's my favorite phrase. And communication is no different. Effective communication is a lot about transparency across the organization, right? So front door to back door, as well as up and down in the organization. And the larger the business that you have, the larger the organization, the more sites, facilities, locations, what have you, the more complex that becomes. You could be in an environment that is multi-site, that is very decentralized, and it will be a real challenge to communicate effectively across that organization. The reality is you just have so many people involved, it becomes very challenging. So keeping the message simple, keeping it clear, creating a forum for people to be able to engage and ask questions and be a part of that journey, those things definitely help. But when it really comes down to it, practice makes perfect, right? We have to practice communicating effectively, we have to put those feedback loops in so we can understand where are we missing our mark at? How can we improve on that communication? And again, I'm not talking about, complex things here in terms of how do you solve for that. It could be something as simple as having, kind of communication boards throughout, each one of the organizations, each one of the departments. It could be having, daily stand-ups or huddles. It could be having some sort of, feedback loop mechanism in place, depending on, let's talk about, your technology stack. So it's definitely not a one size fits all, but when we start to talk about like, hey, what's going on, right? Like unpacking that, a lot of it boils down to simple communication, front door to back door. How do we communicate what the customer expectation is all the way throughout that value chain so we deliver on what that customer expectation is, right? So effective communication. Another big one that I see, again, this can be small companies, big companies, probably more often than not in some more large companies, just because they've got a lot of, tend to have a lot of kind of departments or work cells, a lot of moving parts, but it's redundant processes, right? So where we have, let's say a dedicated final assembly, work cell department, what have you, and the work that is coming to that department should be complete to 100%. And what we'll find from time to time is the fact that that department is actually doing rework for a department previous to it. And there's a whole host of reasons, right? But that happens often. And so it's these kind of duplicated efforts, across departments, across the organization. And so being able to eliminate that, again, you can oftentimes boil that back down to the communication gap that exists, depending on, again, how we're communicating what that expectation is, what's called complete, and being able to move on to that next step. It could be something as simple as, scheduling and or resource allocation, where we're doing a lot of that manually. So you've got the scenario of, hey, don't work on this, go and work on that. And we've already got somebody else working on that. And so we're kind of duplicating this effort. We're not really moving the needle. It feels like we are, right? So think about things like that when we talk about, redundant processes. Another big one, data entry. And this one's it's a bit controversial for me. Because, I'm the first one to kind of say, and this wasn't always the case, but I'm the first one today to kind of say, let's get it done manual. Let's document it manual. Let's get visibility of it manual before we go and, kind of pick a tool, implement a tool. Now, if you already have a tool available, that's kind of completely different. But most of the time, the companies that we're, working with, they don't have something, but we need to get visibility over it. So the fastest way to do that is to document and track things manually. You aggregate that data, you kind of pour through that, see what it's telling you. You put that into a continuous improvement loop, and you kind of keep iterating, right? At some point, you can make the case to take a lot of that manual effort, that manual kind of aggregation, analysis, what have you, and move it into a tool, move it into a technology. And one of the other things that I'll see, again, not really size specific in terms of org, right? Like, doesn't really matter. I see this in small companies. I see this in big companies. But it is the duplication, kind of back to the redundant processes, right? But it's a bit different in terms of that manual data entry, because what happens is they maybe have, let's say, an ERP or an MES, and they also have like an accounting system. And because of the way that their ERP was set up, let's say, they may be duplicating transactions from one technology tool to another. And what often happens in that, when there's no integration and there's no kind of, overarching system architecture, is that you get manual data entry errors. So when you try to reconcile one, tool set to another from a transaction standpoint, there's variances. And then what do? You've got to figure out, not just do you have to clean up those variances, right? You have to research them. You have to figure out like what happened, and again, the larger the organization, the more complex that becomes because, while one organization may, create 10 orders a day, the next organization may be doing 1,000 orders a day, right? Well, 1,000 transactions every single day over the course of a month, and you have to figure out why there is some sort of variance between technology A and, technology B. That could be really challenging, a ton of kind of wasted labor on figuring those things out, right? So that's another kind of, again, argument in and of itself to take a look at, what manual touches do you have to data? Are we duplicating effort from that standpoint? So again, think redundant process, and how can we potentially eliminate that? Maybe we can eliminate one of the tools. Maybe it's a re-implementation or kind of a restructuring of our overall system architecture. Next up on my list is, bottlenecks. And I think this is a catch-all for a lot of things, from a process flow standpoint. And the other confusing part about bottlenecks, right, is like control points. So not all bottlenecks are equal. A bottleneck that is kind of created because of a lack of flow is obviously an issue and an area to, try to unpack and see. So one of the things, that I'll probably get into here in a minute is, management by walking around. So bottlenecks are really tend to be very visual. So if you see a lot of workload or inventory or something, right, piled up, that's a pretty good identifier that you've got yourself a bottleneck there. Now, where it gets a bit confusing is control points. Control points can be bottlenecks, but they're intentional, right? And so that control point serves as a buffer to smooth out the overall flow of the system. And again, that's why all this stuff is so confusing and why it's not just as easy as like, hey, I'm going to read this book, I'm going to go and implement this thing. There's just a lot of moving parts when you talk about, operational efficiency or optimization or, continuous improvement or theory of constraints or, all of it, right? The last piece for me, and again, this is a great place to start if you are in a product-centric business, but inventory management, obsolete material, right? Overstocking or understocking material. And that could be raw material, that could be finished goods, that could be kitted material or subassemblies. It could be, one of any of those things. But this is often where, I used to it's like inventory and, the stock room or whatever you call it, the warehouse. It's like, it's sometimes where things kind of go to get buried, right? Like, we have these extra parts here from this project we completed. What should we do with them? Put them in the warehouse. Sounds great on the surface, right? But what it ends up creating is a real nightmare in terms of both bookkeeping, inventory management, process flow, right? Like it's just all of these things because it ends up being a catch-all. And most of the time we have zero visibility over it because we don't have very rigorous inventory controls. Sometimes we're trying to do, things like, let's say in a manufacturing world, we've got, like an engineered to order business. So they're designing this custom piece of equipment, which means they have to go and, procure all of the different components and sub-assemblies and whatnot for that piece of, finished good, that piece of equipment. And then inevitably, right, we either order the wrong thing, we have to buy things in, specific quantities. So we're left with, parts and pieces, right? And a lot of times it's kind of like, hey, customer already paid for this. We can't sell it with the machine. It's not spare parts. It's literally kind of extra overstock. We can't send it back to, the vendor or the supplier. What do we do with these things? Put them on a shelf, put them in the warehouse. and then these things happen over the course of, months and years, right? And there's a ton of dust on them. And, we know we have all these parts, but nobody really knows what's in those parts. So it becomes very challenging, to ever utilize those parts. So it's like, sure, somebody already paid for the cost of those parts, but we really can't sell them because we have no visibility over it. And they're just taking up space. Everybody kind of has to move them multiple times or step over them. And, everybody knows that they're there, but it's kind of like, don't ask, don't tell. We don't talk about that. So, inventory can create its own little set of, nightmares, and again, hidden efficiencies, throughout processes. So, while there are a bunch of frameworks that you can kind of follow, to help you identify and ultimately eliminate this stuff, we created one. It's called our ideal framework. And it's really just a simple way to kind of walk through the process of, identifying what we're seeing, right? So like those symptoms, that's number one, right? Identify, what symptoms are we able to see? What are we spotting visually as we're doing this management by walking around? Let's document that. Let's kind of prioritize what we're thinking. Determine, right? We need to be able to kind of deep dive into what is happening throughout that process. My favorite go-to there, process mapping, kind of activity, exercise, what have you, bringing people together that are closest to, and adjacent to those processes and talking through like what's happening, what are all the things going on? What can we do to kind of, improve this thing that we've now identified? And again, keeping in mind the whole, right? We don't want to just do a focused, optimization without any thought as to the impact of, down the road, upstream. And that's another reason to bring people adjacent to, right? Like before the process, after the process. Having multiple people throughout the organization have some input and some kind of impact on what happens. It helps that. It helps keep visibility across the organization. So, whomever is kind of running that process mapping event or activity, yes, they're still leading, right? But you've got that outside influence and input. It's like, hey, wait, time out. We can't do that because that's going to add a boatload of work to, what we do. And then we can talk about it. We can talk through those things. We can, brainstorm together on how do we actually move forward, right? That's the next step, enact, right? So after we've actually identified, what can we do, we go through and we prioritize those things. And, I just love a simple kind of prioritization matrix for something like that. Kind of get everybody on board with, here's all the improvements we talked about. Like what's going to have kind of the biggest impact? What's the biggest bang for the buck, right? How do we do something quick, big impact, low cost? That's where I start, right? Working from that all the way up to, lower impact, longer implementation, maybe some cost for us as well. So that's how I think through that prioritization part of the, kind of enacting. Next, assess, right? Like, how'd it go? What did we do? What have we learned? What KPIs are we looking at to understand? Did we move the needle? Did we slide backwards? Are we static? We want to be thinking about how we're going to measure and at what interval, right? Because oftentimes that gets overlooked. But how are we going to measure it? At what interval? And how will we know that we've made forward progress, right? That's what we want to do when we're assessing what we've now, gone and implemented. And the last thing for me, L, right? Learning. What do we learn? How do we apply that in this next round of things? I heard this really amazing. I was actually moderating a panel, and the guy that was kind of being interviewed and giving the bulk of the conversation, the bulk of the talk, had this really great term called try-storming. And I don't think I had ever heard it before, but I always kind of just use brainstorming. But, he's very specific in why he would call it try-storming. And so what I loved about it is the thought behind try-storming, right? versus brainstorming. And again, it's all about how you explain it. So you can certainly use brainstorming and explain it this way. But the whole idea behind it is a lot of times when we're doing kind of, this type of improvement initiative or, kind of process mapping, right? Like Kaizen event, something that is focused and intended to, solve a problem. Oftentimes we kind of throw ideas away, right? Like we put all these ideas up on a board and then we kind of say, that's not going to work. We tried that before. That's too expensive. That's going to take too much time. And the thought behind tristorming and why that became a word for him and, the people that he worked with and taught and all of that is because, trying everybody's idea kind of regardless of what it is really the enabler to other ideas. And this was something I learned, again, this was going years ago, right? Like going back years ago, but that's something that I learned through this brainstorming process, because what I found is that, when I knew something wasn't going to work and I kind of immediately tossed that away, I started getting less ideas. People started to, their input started to fade. And it was because like I was kind of immediately throwing, that's not going to work. That's too expensive, all the stuff, right? So this idea of tristorming and what I call brainstorming, right? But tristorming for sure is a much better term. It is very much about the collective. And sometimes it takes trying an idea that you don't have much confidence in, and maybe a whole group of people don't have much confidence in, but it takes trying that to get more ideas. So this layering of ideas, that's where this learning is really key, right? Because if you try something and it fails, right, you're going to learn something. So it's like we try it, it either moved us forward based on our assessment or it didn't. If it didn't, what did we learn? What shouldn't we do? How though can we take what we learned and iterate on that? Is there some other tweak? Is there some other piece of an idea from somebody else that we can layer into that and get us further down the road? So it becomes this really, kind of cool cycle of things, right? And you can run this on any time frame that you like. Monthly to quarterly is good, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And where you're at in terms of, kind of process and or, kind of system tool maturity. Those are all, kind of considerations as you start to unpack this stuff. So, as we wrap up, I get the question a lot, like what's the impact? Why are we doing this stuff? It's not just to solve problems. It's not just to, kind of boost the bottom line, increase productivity. It does all of those things, right? Like it increases profitability. It, tends to impact cash flow, tends to impact your company culture, all of these initiatives and, improvement ideas and, tactical things that we can do. At the root of all of that, right, is serving the customer. And so applying these concepts and thinking through how we can, kind of operate with excellence. Yeah, it's going to, reduce lead time. Yeah, it's going to reduce your inventory. But it's going to impact your customer. It's going to make it easier for your sales team and your marketing team to kind of continue and complete their cycle. It's going to make, life on the inside of that company from a, manufacturer standpoint, or if you're a service-based business, kind of doing the thing, right? Delivering the work. How are we going to make delivering the work easier for our team? All of these things from a tactical perspective and a strategic perspective are going to impact that. As a reminder, this is an extension of this episode is an extension of the weekly newsletter that I put out. I'll definitely drop that in the show notes if you're interested. No cost to it. Every newsletter article that I send out is 5 minutes or less to read. Kind of unpack one of these topics, give you some practical tips on how you can not just apply it, but ultimately use these things to drive sustainable growth and operate with excellence in your business. So thanks so much for tuning in to the Everyday Business Problems podcast, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.